Welcome, this is the shape video, and we're going to learn about how to make our shapes interesting. So these are things that I've used to make them interesting, and so the first one that I typically use is called size hierarchy, big, medium, small, angles and curves, thick to thin variation, floating shape, shape cutout, and asymmetry. There are some things that will make our shapes not interesting, and that is having them be too complex, too repetitive, or just too simple. Alright, before we get to those, we have to know what we're kind of working with. So for the sake of this video, we're going to kind of define shapes. So on the left, we have simple shapes, and then here on the right we have our modified shapes. To create an interesting shape, usually I take 3 of the modified shapes and combine them. The next steps will be incorporating all the other guides that I mentioned to have it be as interesting as possible. So the first one we're going to go over is size hierarchy. And size hierarchy, big, medium, small, helps to let the viewer know where they should focus their attention first. I tend to put a lot of time and effort into trying to get the big shape to feel good because it will make the rest of the design easier. Here I've labeled them. B is for the big, M is for medium, and S is for the small. The second point is the largest shape is going to be the easiest to read from far away. Because it's going to be easier to read from far away, I tend to adjust the complexity of its shape to depending on its size, meaning I will allow myself to make the bigger shapes usually more complex and try to keep the smaller shapes simpler. And size hierarchy, big, medium, small, you can apply this to character designs, creatures, environments, weapons. Here you can see how I've kind of approached it with each of these. On the left, there's a helmet, the horns, one's medium, the other one is small. And after that, we have a creature head where I've separated the top part of the head from the lower jaw, and then have the horn or ear as a small shape. And after that is the environment, and using kind of a secondary building and the flag to represent the small shape. And then after that we have a weapon, and here I'm using the hilts of the weapon as a small, and then 2 different sides of the axe heads to use to be the big and the medium. Here they are highlighted, so these are the ones that I try to make sure that they read very interesting, because they're going to contribute a lot to your shape because they take up the most space. So and you want to have your biggest shape be very eye-catching, because you want to catch people's eye from no matter how far away they are looking at your design. The next one is angles and curves. Because they're opposites, having both of them will create this contrast and also just provide variety, because they both offer 2 different kind of things. So having both is a very good thing usually for your shapes. After this, you want to be aware that having more of one are going to push certain feelings that are associated with them. I wrote down some of them here, like a 90-degree angle will start to make your things feel mechanical, or varying degrees you can get like some feelings of like a flat structure, like a hard corner. A very sharp angle will read as sharp and dangerous. Kind of underneath that we have friendly. Here we have kind of relaxed or flowing, kind of a little reminiscent of kind of like water or liquid. A curve, kind of soft, and kind of like a squiggly S curve, something very organic, like roots or trees or something like that. I've noticed that the ones in the white section here in the middle, they're not as extreme in shapes as the ones on the left and the right. Because there's less visual information there, your eyes will move quickly through it, and sometimes you can use that to help guide your eye in a direction. Another note here is be careful where you place them on your shapes, because it'll be very noticeable if you have them separated and have like if this shape is specifically all the hard angles are on the right and all the curves are on the left, it'll just feel a little bit strange. So I usually try to distribute them a little bit more evenly. This next point is, while I don't think about how many curves I'm using or how many hard angles I'm using, I usually just try to make sure that I'm incorporating both and that they're distributed evenly. But I imagine with a couple of the things that I've come across, dividing things 50 and like down the middle usually tends to not make things look super interesting. So I suspect that if you're trying to find an ideal ratio, it's anywhere somewhere around 70-30, and it could be kind of, apart from that, would probably create the more interesting shapes. Here are some examples for a shape that's mostly curves, has some hard angles in here, and here's the 50-50 split in the middle, and then we have one over here with mostly hard angles and a little bit of curves. Next is thick to thin variation. So basically our shapes could be turned into visual arrows. What contributes to this is the converging lines or angles that will meet or cross at a certain point, and they act like an arrow, and they direct your eye towards a direction, usually from the wider part to the more tapered section. This is something that I apply to almost every design and almost every shape, and I've found it most useful when I'm applying it to rectangles, because they can be kind of adjusted with applying this thick to thin variation, making some parts of it wider, some parts of it thinner, and so most of the time I find myself using this a lot with creating buildings or pillars or weapons, especially the hilt. Alright, and then the next point is you can use this to create shapes that point towards an important area that you want the viewer to focus on, usually a focal point, or just to kind of maybe you have one point to one place and then have another triangle there to then direct the eye to another direction, kind of creating a little path. Here are some examples below. Here's a character with this kind of like a cape that acts as this giant triangle, directing your eye up towards the head, and then from the head, triangular either clothing or arms will kind of direct you towards what they are holding. And then we have here a creature where the pointed parts of the wings kind of direct your eye towards the head. And for an environment, here's kind of like a building that's in the shape of a triangle that also has a triangular chimney. Because they both kind of point towards the middle, this would be probably a good spot to put something interesting. At the end, we have a weapon. Same thing, we have some triangular shapes pointing down here, and we have a triangular shape from the hilt of the wand or weapon pointing up towards this middle section. These last three are all put together on the same page. So floating shape. Having a part of your interesting shape float or exist almost detached, that also works. We'll add a kind of fantastical element. I found it works especially well when trying to create interesting shapes for sci-fi space or just magical ones. It conveys to the viewer that it's kind of special because it has this ability to float or hover. The other advantage that it has is because it is kind of floating, it kind of has a little bit more space around it, and that lets the viewer focus in on it easier. The next one is shape cutout, and this is where I will remove a piece from inside of one of the shapes, and it tends to make the shape that I'm working with feel lighter. This tends to happen when I'm working with the big shape, and when thinking about size hierarchy, the big, medium, small, that cutout shape can also sometimes act as a medium or a small shape. So you also maybe want to make that one interesting depending on its scale. Another thing to keep in mind when cutting shapes out is that the cutout shape does not necessarily need to be a empty space in the design as you develop it further. This is something that I'll sometimes do, like in this case there's this sword blade that has a part removed, but in the right one I show that I can also just fill that part with a saturated color or a bright value to have it be a shape that is easily kind of recognized, and so that can also be how it's used, just kind of allowing you to plot your interesting shape if it exists inside of another shape. And after this is asymmetry. And asymmetry is one of my favorite ones. It usually adds interest to your designs, and even if you add a little bit of it, because it creates so much variety. And essentially, if you have something that's symmetrical, you're kind of mirrored the left and the right, or the top and the bottom. So there's this element of repetition, and repetition tends to sometimes make things a little boring. If I want to add asymmetry after I've created a symmetrical design, sometimes I'll try to do that with using wear and tear onto the design. That means damaging some pieces of it. And usually when I try to do this, I try to make it really noticeable, not just like scratches on, that are small and not easily read. I try to do this so that it'll be very noticeable, especially in the outer edges of the silhouette. So that sometimes will require like breaking large pieces of forms from the equipment. This is especially effective when you also take some time to add to the design when you add asymmetrical elements on top of this. So here you have an example here of a completely symmetrical design on the left, and then in the green I added some asymmetry just to one side, and then at the same time I also remove some pieces from the design, or from the shape, just to start making it feel a little bit more interesting. And the last point on this one is when working with size hierarchy, big, medium, small, you can work with asymmetry a little bit and imagine it as like a left and a right kind of balancing scale. And sometimes you can place your big shape on the left and then your medium and small shape on the right. This works for a couple other things too, but essentially means that you want to distribute a little bit evenly where the kind of the shapes are. And this also works for focal points too. Lastly, what to avoid. So here are a couple things that I've seen. So sometimes when separating your shapes or creating the floating shape, sometimes you will kind of erase through it and it'll be the same thickness here also around the circle. Here you also want to implement thick to thin variation so that you create a little bit more variety in the negative shapes here. Also, this one also is a circle, and that's a simple shape, so that's another thing that I would probably adjust. This next one here has been kind of separated. I think it just has been separated into too many different shapes, and those really, really thin lines are going to be very difficult to read. Those really thin negative shape lines. And here, this one is a shape that's just been cut into a little bit too much. Sometimes I'll see chains, and just know that you can give the chains a shape, except besides just being a kind of like a drawn square. Also, the square is a simple shape, or rectangle, so you want to kind of play around with it a little bit so that it has a little bit more personality. And this is going to come up again here. I'm going to just jump to these two on the end. Here, this staff here, the top I think might work, but the middle section I've seen quite a bit kind of be left as this kind of line. And same here for like this bow and arrow. You want to make sure that every part of it has a thick to thin variation, just so that it has personality, because a line will usually not convey a lot of a feeling. And here one is a little bit way too complex, and looks like it was done with the lasso tool, which is a great tool, and I will try to. I think I have a video on how to use a lasso tool for creating shapes. You can check it out in I think Photoshop Tools is what the video is called. The one to the left here is there's just too many details and shapes going on in here, and it looks too cluttered or very distracting. Here, the repetition is kind of just making it kind of boring, especially if the shape itself, you have big, medium, small, but the shapes aren't changing they aren't changing in complexity based off of their scale. So yeah, just two examples of just repetition, not really helping to make the shape interesting. And lastly, we have too simple or too complex. So we have simple here shapes on the left, and then on the right it just got a little bit way too complex. Something I like to think of is you want the viewer to be able to either draw or kind of remember what the shape is after seeing it briefly. So that can maybe help you also, or thinking of it as some sort of a logo or something that will be kind of memorable. So yeah, hope you enjoyed the video.